I am 72 years old, and for 35 years I kept a secret nobody would have believed. I lived on this stretch of timber and mud since 1969, and for decades I hid something in the trees behind my mill that I called my friend. This year, that secrecy ended when men in unmarked trucks and in uniforms with clipped badges started circling the dirt road, and the consequences of telling the truth reached farther than I ever imagined. My name is Henry Cole, and what I am about to tell you is the whole truth about why I kept him hidden and what happened when the military finally came for answers. It started on a damp morning in October. The kind of fog that sits in the pines and smells of mold and old sawdust. I was 76 then, though I felt younger and older in the same breath. The woods were quiet, except for the creek and the thud of an axe someone had left by mistake. That morning, I found him half under a fallen maple, chest heaving, limbs tangled in a net left by poachers. His breath was hot and reeked a little of earth and raw meat. His eyes were the thing I remember most. They were enormous and dark, and when I put my hand on his shoulder, he looked at me like he had been waiting. The rescue was the beginning, and for 35 years we lived with the choice that followed. I grew up 3 miles down the creek, barefoot, climbing trees with a pack of other kids who learned their teeth on pine knots. My father taught me how to fell a tree and measure grain and when to leave a sapling alone. Those lessons turned into a trade. I was a logger by profession until my hands could not take the machines anymore. I learned to read maps before I learned to read poetry. When my wife Anna died in 1988, the world narrowed to a piece of land and a schedule. Losing her taught me how to keep a promise to something that could not speak. I kept my word to Anna and then to him. That backstory matters because it is the reason I did not run to the sheriff, to the county, to the nearest university, or to anyone with a microscope. I understood the impulse to catalog and display, but I also understood the violence that comes with exposure. I had seen what curiosity does when it is dressed up as science. I had seen a child of the town take a story and turn it into a spectacle. So, when I found that creature, I made a choice that would follow me like a shadow for 35 years. The rescue itself plays in my mind like a film reel of sensations. The air was thick with rot and green water, the smell of fish and rain and old rope. I remember the cold of the creek against my knees, the slick tug of moss between my fingers, the grunt of weight as I tried to lift that body free. I called out for Tom Harris, who was on a logging run nearby. Tom came with his flashlight, breathing hard, smelling of diesel and tobacco and coffee. In the dim beam, his hand looked small on that shoulder, the way my hand had looked. There were voices then, short and frantic. Tom and I argued about what to do. I still hear his voice, raw with the kind of panic men do not usually show. The creature made a sound like a low wail that felt like a stone settling in your chest. I splashed water on its face. I cut the net with my pocket knife until my fingers bled. And when it finally pushed up and blinked the wet from its lashes, it stared at me like recognition had come late, but somehow right. Tom said we should call somebody. I said no. He said the law would take it. I said the law would cage it. He said we could not keep it. I said we had kept worse secrets. He said you cannot be the only person to decide. I said I had decided when I crushed the net. He said, who will feed it when you are gone? I said, I would teach it, and it will shelter itself. He said, what if they come? I said, then I will tell the truth. He said, that was not the right time. I said, we would wait. He said, he would help. I said, thank you. I said, do not tell Mary. He nodded and pulled his cap down and walked back into the fog with his truck idling like an animal. The scene had sound that was small and precise. The creek ticked like a clock, the insect chorus hissed, The drip of water from leaves sounded like distant rain. My boots sank into black soil, and the creature shivered. I remember the texture of its hair, which was coarse and damp, smelling faintly of pine sap and skunk. I remember the slickness of its palm when it gripped my wrist. I remember tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline on my own lips. I remember the softness of a sound that might have been gratitude. Those images framed the rest of our life together. In the days that followed, I built shelter in the back of an old woodshed a quarter-mile from the mill. I cleaned and stitched its wounds, used salves and boiled tea leaves to singed skin, and fed it scraps and whole fish I caught at dawn. I had no training for care like that. I had only hands and instinct. It learned to trust me in small gestures. It would place a heavy palm on my knee to steady itself, and it would follow the sound of my chainsaw like a dog follows a whistle. We developed a language of glances and small sounds. I named him Bramble because he loved the bramble patch by the creek where the raspberries grew, and because the name sounded like something a man in the woods might give something he could not fully explain. The first nights I slept with the back door ajar to listen for his breathing. The smell of wet fur filled the shed, and the night air tasted of wood smoke and river mud. He was not like any animal I had seen at a distance. He had curiosity and discernment. He learned the time of the mail truck and the pattern of my neighbor Mary Whitaker, who walked her spaniel early every morning and pretended not to see anything at the edge of the trees. He learned to avoid the town road and to watch the sky when planes passed. We developed rituals. I would bring him pieces of apple, sometimes canned corn, sometimes smoked trout. He liked the simple things and would hold food delicately as though each piece were precious. Over the years, we adapted our lives. I would leave a trap disguised as a broken box to catch squirrels and bring them back when food ran low. I would tell lies to curious neighbors about noises and lights to keep them looking away. I kept a calendar scribbled with what I brought and when I had seen him. I paid Dr. Elaine Park with jars of honey and favors so she would look in the opposite direction when someone asked for biological samples. I altered the logs and files at the mill so there would be no pattern to the times I left. I bounced the grill of the road with a rock to make it seem like a loose piece of machinery. I taught him to trust the rhythm of my footsteps. Those years were simple in their daily chores, but loaded with the weight of secrecy. We were not always peaceful. There were nights the wind would push a sound that made him flinch. Nights where some element of human cruelty left meat tied to wires as a test. Nights when he bled and I chased a terror I did not name. Once a hunter with a cheap shotgun came through, and I saw the reflection of his lamp on the creature's eyes, and I wanted to move the world. I stood between a man with a weapon and something I had sworn to protect, and I argued until my voice cracked. I do not say that to glorify myself. I say it because tension built like rot in wood and finally would need to be cut away. The first time authorities approached me in any formal way was when a satellite image with odd tree gaps showed up in a regional environmental forum. A drone had flown the ridge and captured a patch that did not match the usual logging patterns, an unnatural circle of younger growth. Someone in a nearby university noticed and shared it with a small group that included Captain Robert Hale from a military environmental unit. Soldiers came first in plain clothes, asking routine questions about timber theft and illegal traps. Then Sheriff Dale Monroe and Officer Anita Cruz came by under the pretense of a noise complaint. The true pivot occurred the day a low-flying reconnaissance drone hovered too near the treetops, and I heard the whir of rotors like a wasp in a jar. A week later, men with badges and a portable scanner parked by my mailbox and asked to see where I kept my equipment. The first government conversation felt like a poker game. Captain Robert Hale explained that they had an interest in anomalies on federal land and that anything unusual could not remain private for long. He spoke in a tone meant to reassure and to claim authority. Dr. Elaine Park arrived as a civilian consultant with a notebook and a smile that did not reach her eyes at first. Jenna Morales from the county paper asked questions about ownership and conservation and made notes about my silence. They opened with polite phrases that carried the urgency of official intention. The negotiation that followed read like a courtroom where no judge yet had been appointed. The military wanted custody for study under an agreement called a custodial research protocol. They offered anonymized study, funding for habitat protection, and a promise of confidentiality. In the back of my head, I could hear Anna telling me to be careful. The language in front of me used words like sample and amplicon and chain of custody as though they were gentler than cages. I had to decide between the promise of scientific respect and my visceral fear of being the man who opened a door that could not be closed. The negotiation began in my kitchen with coffee strong enough to bite and with the rain on the tin roof. Captain Hale sat with his hands folded. Dr. Park had a laptop open. Sheriff Monroe looked at me like he wanted to stand on both sides. The first round of dialogue had the structure of a tough conversation. Captain Hale said, "We are not here to take anything without consent." I said, "Consent belongs to the creature." Captain Hale said, "We are offering a sanctuary under oversight." I said, "Sanctuary under oversight often becomes custody under label." Dr. Park said there are protocols to minimize harm. I asked, "What protocols?" Dr. Park said, "Non-invasive observation, camera traps, minimal blood draws with local anesthesia." I asked who would own the data. Captain Hale said the data would be jointly held by their unit and a university lab. I said, "And if someone leaks?" Captain Hale said, "Leaks are illegal." I said, "You cannot unmake a leak." Sheriff Monroe said, "We can provide legal protections." I said, "Legal protections do not feed a soul." He smiled sadly and said, "Sometimes law is the only way to protect." I said, "Sometimes law becomes the force that takes." Dr. Park said, "We could arrange for independent oversight." I said, "I wanted guarantees in writing, public guarantees, and the right to withdraw consent." Captain Hale said, "That would complicate scientific rigor." I said, "Then science must learn to work with trust." In that kitchen, I remember the smell of coffee and wet wool, the sound of rain, the scrape of a chair, the weight of a pen on paper, the warmth of my palms against a mug, and the distant howl of a fox. Those small senses framed the moral calculus. Eventually they made offers, and I countered with conditions. I insisted that sampling be minimal, that no capture occur without my presence, that the creature remain on my land under joint monitoring, and that there be an independent conservancy board which included Mary Whitaker, Tom Harris, Pastor Luke Benson, and an outside ethicist. They grumbled and stretched terms, and after 3 days of back and forth, they wrote an interim agreement with language that tried to balance curiosity and dignity. The research phase that followed was methodical and fraught. Dr. Park set up camera traps that used infrared, motion detection, and time-stamped footage. They deployed acoustic recorders to capture vocalizations and set up a scheduled observation window for behavior logging. For authorization, the unit provided a custodian number and a chain of custody form that I was required to sign when collecting any naturally shed hair. They used sterile swabs on hair we found snagged on a fence post. The process of sequencing required samples to a university lab where mitochondrial markers were amplified and compared against known mammals. The lab used polymerase chain reaction cycles of 40, Sanger sequencing for specific loci, and a comparative database run against NCBI reference sequences. That protocol was described to me in simple terms and in a way I could understand. I was told results would take from 2 to 6 weeks per batch and that cross-contamination controls would be strict. In the field, the researchers were careful but human. They praised the way Bramble avoided traps and nicknamed him at first with awkward tenderness. Dr. Park asked permission before any procedure, handled instruments with gloved hands that smelled of latex and sanitizer, and explained every step. I watched screens showing heat maps and spectrograms of calls that sounded like low moans and percussive knocks against wood. The data suggested unique vocal structures and problem-solving behavior. There were nights when I sat by the shed and listened to recorded sequences with Tom and Mary and felt like we were reading love letters from another creature. Leaking began small. A graduate student posted an encrypted image to a private forum, and someone screenshotted it. The image ended up in an online chat room and then on a blog that specialized in cryptids. From there, the speed of exposure was like a branch snapping in a high wind. By the time Jenna Morales published an article with cautious phrasing, the local forum had already exploded with speculation. Rumors spread that a Bigfoot had been found, that the military had a specimen, that someone had been lying. I remember the first time a camera crew showed up with lights too bright and microphones that smelt like plastic. People I had known for 50 years peered from porches with a mixture of awe and accusation. There were specific moments of tension that feel carved into me. The first I remember is when a hunter came at night and aimed a light into the brambles. It lasted only a minute or two before I slammed into him and took the gun from him by force of old habit and anger. The moment was loud and smelled of diesel and fear. For 2 paragraphs of my memory, I see the hunter backed against the truck, his eyes wide, his fingers shaking on a metal barrel, and I see Bramble pressed against the shed wall with his mouth open in a sound that might have been a grunt of pain. I had to decide to call the sheriff or to move the hunter and erase the evidence. I chose to scare him off and force my silence down like a nailed board. It cost me sleep and the thickness of anxiety for weeks. The second moment came when soldiers in camouflage parked a truck in my lane and left a card saying they would return. The radios blurted codes and the dogs in town howled. My chest tightened and my hands shook. I felt like a man pressed between 2 tides. A third moment of tension was when a leak suggested the creature had been collared for tracking. The story was false but spread like a contagion. Men with brittle authority came to my gate asking for permission to fly drones and to run sniffer dogs. I lay awake listening to the hum of a rotocraft and the low radio chatter in a language meant to assert jurisdiction. The fourth moment came at the hearing when activists arrived with signs and the town church organized a vigil. I sat in a hard chair and listened to people call me a hero and a villain in the same breath. Each of those moments I lived through, and each required the same slow work of choosing where to concede and where to stand firm. As the public revealed itself, the press framed the story in the ways the press does. Headlines asked if I had been harboring a myth. Comment sections filled with threats and with prayers. People like Jenna Morales wrote pieces that tried to stay honest while the paper ran a sidebar with rapid opinion. Mary Whitaker, my neighbor for 35 years, said she implored me to tell the truth so the town would not be divided. Pastor Luke Benson led a community meeting for compassion and for caution. Tom Harris stood by me and refused to trade our secret for attention. Officer Anita Cruz worked overtime to maintain order when people with bright cameras and loud voices descended. Sheriff Dale Monroe balanced law and his own doubts about whether the creature should be protected or cataloged. I named 8 people who mattered by name because their actions were real and complex in how they affected the outcome. Tom Harris helped on the rescue and later on stood as a witness in meetings with the military. Mary Whitaker, who walked the road and brought me pies, advocated for a conservancy board. Jenna Morales, the journalist, pushed the story into daylight and forced official responses. Captain Robert Hale represented the military and its pragmatic offers. Dr. Elaine Park ran the scientific work and argued for data that could lead to protection. Sheriff Dale Monroe and Officer Anita Cruz were tasked with keeping peace. Pastor Luke Benson tried to hold the town together. Each of them did what they thought was right, and each left marks I still see. Legal steps followed. The interim agreement turned into a formal memorandum which included clauses about custody, consent, data ownership, and public disclosure. There were debates about whether to classify the presence as a protected species or as an object of national interest. Conservationists argued to list the creature under an endangered category to prevent hunting and capture. Military lawyers asked for limited declassification windows to preserve integrity of study. We sat through meetings where lawyers used phrases like chain of custody and admissible evidence, and where ethicists invoked consent and dignity. In a small-town courtroom, I testified and listened as historical precedent was mined for guidance. Bramble declined in age as seasons brought gray to his fur. He moved slower and his appetite changed. The day he died was a quiet morning when the mist sat low like a curtain. He had spent his last night curled in the bramble pouch I made with old blankets and fleece. I found him with the dawn, alive but barely breathing, eyes open and looking at the place where once we saw stars through the canopy. I held him and spoke softly. He made a long, low sound like a wind through reeds and closed his eyes. Tom and Mary were there. We wrapped him in a canvas sheet and walked to a clearing that Bramble had always visited in late summer. There we dug a hole with our bare hands. Pastor Luke said a few words about stewardship and about respect. I put him in the ground and covered him with earth and with raspberries and with a small wooden plaque that read, "Bramble, Friend to Henry, 1979 to 2017. Deciding what to do with his remains brought other decisions. I had been offered by the military to take the body for study. Dr. Park asked for permission to collect tissue samples post-mortem under a protocol that involved formalin fixation of small blocks, preservation of hair shafts for microscopic analysis, and submission of bone fragments for isotope analysis. The military offered to curate remains at a secure facility with controlled access. I refused a public burial that involved exhumation for display. I agreed to allow limited sampling and a small autopsy with the condition that the remainder be returned for burial at the clearing. The technical description of what they did and how they handled samples was straightforward. They took less than 5 grams of tissue for histology, kept a chain of custody logged with timestamps, and pledged to store raw sequence reads in a secure repository with restricted access for 3 years. The paperwork smelled like ink and bureaucracy, and also like an attempt to create trust in a language I did not always understand. The epilogue plays out in time and in small shifts of community memory. 1 month after the burial, the town was quieter than it had been during the leaks. People brought flowers and left small stones at the plaque. A conservancy board met and drafted the beginnings of a protection ordinance aimed at preventing unauthorized traps and at creating a buffer zone in the Bramble clearing. The board included Mary, Tom, Pastor Luke, and an independent ethicist from the state. The military provided funding for motion-activated cameras and for a small scholarship in memory of Anna, who had taught me to read. I walked the clearing each morning and sat on a log and watched the sunlight pattern the leaves like an old film. I felt the absence like a weight and a relief at the same time. Some nights I still wake to the sound of wood creaking and imagine the rhythm of a large breath. 3 months later, the research papers were in draft, and the university lab had posted a cautious preprint about unusual genetic markers that did not match known regional mammals. The authors used careful language and proposed more study rather than sensational conclusions. Jenna Morales published a long-form piece that looked at the moral choices we had made and questioned the ethics of both secrecy and exposure. The town council passed a non-binding resolution to respect the clearing as a memorial and to support habitat conservation. Visitors still came, but fewer than before. The Conservancy set up a small fund supported by donations for habitat restoration. Mary organized a vigil for the small things people lose and invited the community to read poems. Tom took down an old target range and planted native shrubs. The noise of cameras diminished and the sound of normal life returned in a measured way. 6 months later, events had settled into a pattern. The lab published a peer-reviewed article describing mitochondrial sequences that suggested an unclassified lineage, and the article referenced the samples taken under our agreement, but it also respected the confidentiality clauses we had negotiated. The paper called for an international effort to document cryptic lineages without exploitation. The military released a statement acknowledging involvement but emphasizing their role in habitat protection and in supporting community-led efforts. A small documentary team did a sympathetic piece that focused on human choices and on the idea that some discoveries require humility as much as inquiry. The Conservancy succeeded in securing a permanent easement for the clearing, and the plaque remained. I turned down offers to commercialize the story. I refused interviews that sought spectacle. I kept one recorded hour with Dr. Park for scientific purposes, and I left the rest in the quiet. Looking back, I can say this. I gave Bramble 35 years of life in peace, and that choice will always define me as much as the land defines where a man grew old. I was wrong in some things and right in others. I do not ask you to take my side without question. I only ask that you consider how curiosity can become a hunger and that protection can become secrecy that hides harms. There are new policies now in place about how unusual finds are handled. There are pledges from a university and from a conservancy about respect and custodial dignity. There is a small memorial in the clearing and a fund for habitat work in Bramble's name. If I had to choose again, I would do much the same. I would try harder to build trust earlier, and I would write agreements in clearer language. I would seek independent oversight while holding my ground about dignity. I would teach others that sometimes keeping a secret is not cowardice, but the only way to protect something delicate from a hungry world. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. Tell me in a line what you would have done. I protected him. I would have told. I would have negotiated. Your answer matters because it helps others understand the hard choices people make when the private and the public collide. My name is Henry Cole, and I lived with a secret for 35 years. I buried him where the raspberries grow. I visit that clearing when the light is soft, and I think of Anna and of small mercies. If you want to hear more about the documents and the scientific work we allowed and the way the town changed, subscribe and I will tell you what was learned and what was lost.